In this video, we're going to take a look at Lamy Crystal Azurite. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. I see this coming across to me as a kind of blue leaning purple, but not bad in how it does it. But I did have to go verify online what color this was supposed to be, whether it was a blue that leaned purple or a purple that leaned blue. It can shade occasionally. Now, when it does, it's very nice. But that shading, you really have to set the stage to make it happen. You have to make sure that you're using the right kind of pen and the right kind of paper, and I can't really be bothered to do that most of the time. There's a lot of tone variation that happens depending on the pen you use, but it does step up gradually in how it does it. So you can get kind of an expected result as you move to a larger nib. You would get it a bit darker, and it's nice that it does it in steps so that it's not crazy like it's a different ink. The only issue that I actually had with this ink at all was in the Van Gogh, and that was while doing the larger writing sample for the pen review. I found that it skipped a whole bunch. Now, I did find during the day of writing that it skipped a bunch, and I've never had that pen do it, but it did it with this ink, just showing that this ink may not be a great match for the Visconti Van Gogh, or at least mine. So if you do find that you have that, then maybe test another ink before you downgrade the thought of a pen. That flow issue did make me almost wish that I still did viscosity tests. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today, that pen is a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We do get some very interesting shading in when it does show up. Like when you see the word of, the top and the bottom of the F is darker than the rest of the word, but just a little bit. Solutions goes from a nice darker tone to a very dark tone. So when it shades especially nicely. The medium is a little darker in tone than the fine. It has no feather, no spread, a couple of moments of shading that they grab your eye, but they don't grab your eye as the idea of it is shading. Like in, the I is darker than the N. In the word the letter H is a little bit darker than what's around it. Now, this type of shading is not all over in this, but it is present. In the stub, we get no feather, no spread, no shading. It's only a tad bit darker than what we're seeing in the medium, but its general performance looks very good. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Sailor Pro Gear Slim Mini with a fine nib, a Kaweco Sport with a medium nib, a Pilot Metropolitan with a 1.0 stub. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather and no spread. We're not getting any of the shading here that we got on that Clairfontaine paper either. Now, the Clairfontaine paper is coated and this isn't. It's a bit more absorbent, so not getting some of that shading can be a little expected. The medium is just a tad bit darker than the fine. It has no feathering, no spread. It has no shading whatsoever coming through. It's a nice purple-ish, blurplish tone. The stub, a little bit darker than the medium. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has no shading. It is the nicest tone, I think, on this cream color paper. Looking at the back of the page, I was a little surprised by some of the spots that are coming through very deep on the fine, but nothing touched the other page. So there was no bleeding that was any kind of a problem like that. But we do get a lot of ghosting as the ink gets very deep into the paper. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on moleskin paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread, we actually get one or two spots of shading. You can see it in the A and the S in the word equations. You can see it in the A and the S in also, or in the H and T in shortly. So it is there and it's nice when it occurs. The medium is just about the same tone as the fine. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has no shading. It's just being a solid performing purple ink, which in itself isn't a bad thing unless you're going after particular other qualities in ink. The stub is about the same tone as the medium and the fine. So on this moleskin paper, very solid performing as far as keeping the same predictable tone. The stub has no spreading, no feathering, no shading whatsoever. When we look at the back of the page on this Moleskine notebook, we see that it consistently is outperforming the Leuchtterm. We do get some ghosting that's going on, which is not unusual, and no bleed through at all. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, we get no shading. It here looks a little more blue leaning than we've seen on some of the other papers. Now, this paper has had a tendency to alter a color in how it looks a little bit, and I think it's bringing out a little bit more of the blue than and suppressing some of the purple. Now, the medium is just the slightest bit darker than the fine. It has no feathering, it has no spread. It actually has one or two moments that shading does occur. The H in having a little bit, the TI of negative a little bit darker than the rest of the word. So there is some that could be had. Looking at the stub, it is, I want to say, about the same tone as far as how dark it is, but it's showing more of the purple than the blue on the rest of the writing sample, so it almost looks like it would be a different ink. Now, it has no feathering, no spread, moments of shading that are occurring kind of like it did on the medium. Like you see, the E in negative is a bit darker, that the M in numbers is a little bit darker, so there's occasional letters where it does show through. Looking at the back of the page, we have a normal amount of ghosting and we have no bleed that touches the page underneath. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Lilac Satin. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Gummy Berry. Here is Califolio Violet. Here is Private Reserve Purple Mojo. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feathering, but we do have a tiny bit of spread when we compare it to other papers. But on this paper, it's looking really good. It does look a bit more purple than it does blue, which is nice. It has no shading coming through at all. The medium is about the same tone as the fine, with no feathering, no spread, no shading whatsoever. Now, I say it's about the same tone, but it's a slightly different color. So we see a little bit more of the purple in the fine and a little bit more of the blue in the medium. Now, the stub is a bit darker than what we get with the medium or the fine, but it comes back towards being a little more purple. It has no feathering, no spread, no shading that's occurring, but it is a nice solid performer on such an inexpensive paper. When we look at the back of the page, we do see that we get no bleeding that touches the page underneath. We get a normal amount of ghosting, which isn't a problem. Again, no bleed through, so it's doing awesome. While it's nice to compare it to other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a brown ink by Diatramentis El Greco, or Maroon. Here is a gray ink by Diamine, their 150th anniversary Silver Fox. Here is a black ink by Monteverde, Document Black. Here is a green ink by Noodler's, their L. Lawrence. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get some spread, which we expect on this paper. We get tiny feathers, really consistent tiny feathers with that spread all over. But again, I don't see this as something that stops people from using it. I don't think the color is as interesting here, although it does get much darker and much more purple than we've seen in a bunch of the other writing. The medium is a little bit lighter than the fine, which is surprising. This paper's very backwards in what goes on. Now, we are going to get some spread on the medium. We are going to get some of those same very tiny feathers that we got on the fine, but nothing to be a problem. The 1.1 stub, we see that we get no feathers, strangely. Almost no feathers. I only see some tiny ones on the O of sorry. But for the most part, we're really not seeing very many feathers. It did much better here than it did with the medium or the fine. Now, we're not really seeing a lot of spread, but there is a tiny bit of spread that's occurring. We're getting no real shading, but we don't expect it with this paper. Looking at the page underneath, we get a lot of spots where it did touch the page underneath. Now, I don't think that fully corrupts that page, but if it bothers you, like it does me sometimes, then you might not want to use it. So we get plenty of bleeding, we get plenty of show through, but it is very cheap paper. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? When I'm looking at this ink, I'm really drawn to the shading that I saw on Clairfontaine with that Sailor Fine nib. But I don't use that pen and that paper all the time to get this kind of result. If it could do that all the time, it would be absolutely an amazing purple ink. But if I have to choose something, then I'm choosing based on what do I get on a majority of the time. And I really found that a medium flow stub nib most of the time gave me a color that I really liked. It was a little more purple leaning than blue leaning. It did bring out some shading at times, which is nice to see in your writing and adds a little bit of flair and interest. Makes what you write more interesting. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching.